something happened that people are already trying to simplify, and it really shouldn't be simplified. Mark Carney didn't casually float a new Indo-Pacific partnership. He didn't hint at it during a panel or tuck it into a think tank speech. What he did was far more deliberate than that. He introduced it formally, publicly, with signed framework agreements, named partner nations, concrete trade commitments, and a structure so detailed that several allied governments later told reporters the groundwork had been underway for months before the political moment finally arrived. And that moment came during Canada's confrontation with Washington. Within an hour of the announcement, Donald Trump responded. The language was angry, direct. He accused Canada of betrayal and issued threats that were unusually specific. But here's the part that caught the attention of foreign policy analysts almost immediately. Those accusations revealed something important about how the White House appears to be interpreting the situation, and according to many experts, that interpretation misses what Carney actually built and why several countries were ready, almost waiting, for a move like this. Because what we're watching unfold isn't just a trade disagreement that got messy. It looks much bigger than that. What's happening right now resembles a strategic shift. Over the past several months, Canada has faced sustained economic pressure from the United States. That pressure has shown up across nearly every dimension of the relationship: auto tariffs, agricultural bans, military partnership suspensions, disputes over technology regulation. And instead of simply reacting to each individual pressure point, Canada appears to have taken a different approach. It used the pressure itself as political fuel to begin constructing something new. A framework designed to reduce reliance on three things at the same time: American market access, American military structures, and American digital infrastructure. And here's the striking part. Before Washington fully grasped what was taking shape, Canada had already persuaded Japan, South Korea, Australia, the United Kingdom, and several European partners to step inside that architecture. 7 founding nations, 2 additional countries observing with a path toward membership. Now, if you follow this channel, you know I try to slow these moments down a little, because announcements like this can sound abstract until you look at the details. So let's walk through what actually happened. On May 5th, 2026, Mark Carney delivered a keynote address at the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada's annual summit in Vancouver. The location was not accidental. Vancouver faces the Pacific. The symbolism was visible almost immediately. From the opening lines of that speech, Carney introduced something called the Indo-Pacific Democratic Trade and Technology Alliance. It's a multilateral framework bringing together Canada, Japan, South Korea, Australia, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Denmark as founding members. Indonesia and Vietnam joined the arrangement as observers with a pathway toward full participation. And the structure itself rests on 4 pillars. The first pillar focuses on preferential market access between the member countries. Agricultural goods, manufactured products, and digital services are all included. The design intentionally reduces how dependent any one country becomes on a single trading partner. The second pillar centers on critical minerals. Canadian, Australian, and Indonesian resources combine with Japanese and South Korean processing capacity and European manufacturing capability. Together, the goal is to create an integrated supply chain that doesn't rely on American regulatory approval or market entry at any stage. The third pillar is about digital sovereignty. Member nations coordinate approaches to platform regulation, data governance, and technology infrastructure, so they present a unified position when facing outside pressure. And the fourth pillar involves defense technology and intelligence cooperation. It builds on existing security relationships, but creates additional channels that function independently of American planning structures. Now, when you look closely at those 4 pillars, something becomes very clear. Each one corresponds to a specific tool Washington has used against Canada during the past 5 months. Tariffs and trade bans, export sovereignty directives, technology investigations under Section 301, disputes involving military agreements and NORAD modernization funding. The alliance doesn't just exist alongside those pressures. It is structured in direct response to them, which means Carney didn't simply assemble a diplomatic coalition. He assembled one designed, very carefully, to blunt multiple forms of economic pressure at the same time. And when 7 nations sign founding framework documents together at a single summit, while 2 others move in as observers, and Washington learns about the structure only as it's being announced, that tells you something about the preparation behind the scenes. Because the groundwork for this moment didn't appear overnight, it had been building quietly across earlier chapters of the confrontation. Energy agreements in Europe had already created working relationships with countries like the Netherlands. Agricultural technology partnerships with the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan had established trade cooperation models. Canada's critical mineral reserve strategy showed a willingness to use resource wealth strategically rather than simply export it as raw commodity supply. And legal challenges through USMCA reinforced Canada's reputation for defending its position through rules-based systems instead of reactive nationalism. Step by step, those pieces formed the diplomatic foundation for what would eventually become this broader alliance framework. And by the time Carney stepped onto that stage in Vancouver, many of those relationships were already in motion. Hi again. Well, not really again. Let's just keep going. Because once you start looking at how this alliance came together, the timeline becomes interesting. Reporting from outlets like the Financial Times and Nikkei Asia suggests that conversations with Japan actually began earlier in 2026. Officials inside Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry had been talking with Global Affairs Canada since late February. At first, the focus was fairly narrow: critical mineral supply chains. Japan wanted to reduce dependence on Chinese rare earth processing. Canada, at the same time, wanted to reduce how dependent its mineral exports were on American market access. Those two interests lined up neatly. For a while, those talks were exploratory. Then something changed. In mid-March, the United States issued what it called the Export Sovereignty Directive. That directive confirmed that Canadian critical mineral exports could become targets of American regulatory action. According to sources involved in the discussions, that moment shifted the tone. The talks moved from theoretical to operational. South Korea joined the discussions in early April. Australia followed shortly after, and the timing there mattered. Canada had just suspended participation in the NORAD modernization process, and Australian officials reportedly concluded that the pattern of American unilateral actions toward Canada was significant enough to accelerate their own thinking about alternative alliance structures. And then there's the United Kingdom. London had its own calculation unfolding for years. After Brexit, Britain spent roughly 6 years trying to negotiate a comprehensive bilateral free trade agreement with the United States. Progress never really arrived. So when Canada proposed a multilateral trade framework, one involving familiar democratic partners and not dependent on American participation, it offered something Britain had quietly been looking for: a structure that didn't force a choice between Washington and everyone else. That's the context in which Carney's announcement landed. At exactly 10 a.m. on May 5th, he stepped onto the stage at the Asia-Pacific Foundation Summit in Vancouver. The audience included trade ministers, finance ministers, and senior diplomatic officials from the 7 founding countries. International media outlets were broadcasting live: NHK, BBC, Reuters, Bloomberg, Al Jazeera. Carney spoke for 32 minutes. Every line sounded measured, almost surgical, like someone who understood the speech would be studied in capitals around the world before the day was over. He began with a line that set the tone. Canada does not build alliances against anyone. It builds alliances for something. Then he explained what that something meant. Rules-based trade that respects national regulatory authority. Supply chains that avoid single geopolitical choke points. Digital cooperation among democracies that share similar expectations around privacy and platform accountability. Defense partnerships grounded in reciprocity rather than permanent dependence. The room, according to several people there, was completely silent while he spoke. Then he continued. The countries participating in the alliance together represent more than 1.4 billion people. Their combined economies exceed $22 trillion. And their shared premise, he said, is that democratic sovereignty in the 21st century requires structural independence as well as formal alliances. He made another point that sounded simple, but carried weight. These countries were not leaving existing relationships. They were adding new ones. Because the previous 5 months had demonstrated something clearly, no single bilateral partnership, however important, can guarantee resilience on its own. At that point, Carney paused. 3 seconds, just long enough for the line to settle. Then he delivered the sentence that people immediately began repeating afterward. The Indo-Pacific Democratic Trade and Technology Alliance is open to every democracy that shares these values. Its door remains open, including to the United States. Now, what happened in the hour after that speech was immediate. Financial markets responded almost instantly. The Japanese yen strengthened against the dollar. Australian mining stocks jumped after the announcement of the Critical Minerals Compact, with several lithium and cobalt companies gaining between 4 and 7% in early trading. Canada's dollar reached its strongest position against the US dollar since the confrontation began months earlier. In South Korea, technology manufacturing stocks moved upward. Many of those companies had been exposed to American semiconductor export controls, so the digital sovereignty framework caught investors' attention quickly. And in London, trade analysts described Britain's participation as one of the most strategically important trade decisions the country had made since Brexit. The reason, they said, was straightforward. The alliance provided a multilateral economic framework with stable democratic partners, without requiring a bilateral agreement with an American administration that had shown little urgency in completing one. But the market reaction focused most intensely on one part of the alliance, the Critical Minerals Compact, because the supply chain it outlines is unusually comprehensive. Canadian and Australian mining output, Indonesian nickel reserves, Japanese and South Korean processing capacity, European industrial demand, lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, rare earth elements, all of it connected into a single production ecosystem. And the design has one defining characteristic. It operates independently of American supply chains, American processing facilities, and American regulatory approval. Structurally speaking, analysts say it mirrors something Canada announced earlier in the confrontation, the Sovereign Energy Declaration. In other words, it represents an architectural alternative to dependence on a single market. And once that structure became clear, the political reaction from Washington followed quickly. Trump's response arrived at 1:18 p.m. that same day. It came through a Truth Social post that observers immediately noticed was longer than his typical reactions. The tone was sharper too, and the accusations were unusually detailed. He called the alliance a deliberate betrayal of the United States. He accused Mark Carney of coordinating with foreign governments to weaken American economic power. He singled out Japan, South Korea, and Australia, describing them as nations that rely on American military protection, but had just turned around and, in his words, stabbed the United States in the back by joining Canada's initiative. Then the message went further. Trump threatened to review American defense commitments to every country that had signed the founding framework. He warned that new tariffs could be imposed across all alliance members. And he demanded that Canada withdraw from the arrangement immediately or face what he described as the most comprehensive economic consequences in the history of American trade policy. That accusation, betrayal, is the piece analysts keep returning to, because the logic behind it assumes that allied countries forming multilateral trade frameworks with each other constitutes hostility toward the United States. But look closely at the countries involved: Japan, South Korea, Australia, the United Kingdom, the European partners named in the agreement. Every one of them already maintains formal alliances with the United States. They all operate within bilateral and multilateral trade arrangements with Washington. None of the alliance documents restrict trade with the United States. None require members to scale back security cooperation below existing treaty commitments. The framework doesn't direct anyone away from the United States. What it does instead is create additional options. And those options reduce the leverage that any single bilateral relationship, including the American one, can exercise over national policy decisions. That distinction matters because building frameworks that expand strategic options is something the United States itself has done for decades. NATO works that way. The Five Eyes intelligence partnership works that way. The Quad in the Indo-Pacific works that way. The United States has historically encouraged its partners to cooperate multilaterally so that security, technology, and economic resilience don't depend on just one relationship. From that perspective, what Canada and its partners just built looks very familiar. Foreign policy experts began describing the alliance almost immediately in historical terms. Roland Paris, a professor of international affairs at the University of Ottawa, told Canada's CBC that Carney's initiative may become the most significant Canadian strategic move since the country joined NATO in 1949. His argument was that the structure wasn't designed as a temporary reaction to one political dispute. Each pillar, the trade framework, the mineral supply chains, the digital coordination, the defense technology cooperation, creates its own institutional momentum. Companies begin investing. Governments develop bureaucracies around the agreements. Supply chains form. And once those pieces exist, dismantling them becomes difficult because domestic industries start depending on them. Sheila Smith, a senior fellow for Japan Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, offered another perspective during an interview with Bloomberg. She pointed out that Japan's decision to join didn't emerge suddenly during the past few months. Tokyo had been worried about unilateral trade actions since the first Trump administration years earlier. Since 2019, Japan had already been diversifying its supply chains and exploring ways to reduce vulnerability around critical minerals and technology manufacturing. What Japan needed, she said, was a credible multilateral structure offered by a trusted democratic partner. Canada's proposal provided exactly that. So for Tokyo, joining the alliance wasn't simply a reaction to recent tensions. It was the culmination of a strategy that had been developing for years. And then there's the part of Trump's response that analysts described as the most revealing and possibly the most risky. The threat to review American defense commitments to alliance members. Those commitments aren't informal arrangements that can disappear with a single statement online. The security agreements with Japan, South Korea, and Australia are formal treaties ratified by the United States Senate. They're embedded in long-standing defense frameworks involving joint bases, integrated command systems, and decades of military planning. So when a president threatens to reconsider those commitments because allies joined a trade and technology alliance, the signal travels far beyond the immediate dispute. Diplomats in allied capitals read it carefully. And the interpretation many analysts offered is straightforward. If defense guarantees begin to sound conditional, if they appear tied to whether allies make trade decisions Washington approves of, then those allies start considering ways to reduce that vulnerability. Not by abandoning existing relationships, but by building additional structures alongside them, which, if you step back for a moment, sounds very close to what Canada has been doing for the past 5 months. Where things stand right now is actually pretty clear, even if the implications are still unfolding. The Indo-Pacific Democratic Trade and Technology Alliance now exists as a formal structure. 7 countries signed on as founding members. 2 others, Indonesia and Vietnam, entered as observers with a path toward full membership if they choose to move forward. The framework itself contains those 4 pillars we talked about earlier. The market access system linking member economies through preferential trade. The critical minerals compact tying together resource extraction, processing, and industrial demand. The digital sovereignty coordination that aligns regulatory approaches around technology platforms and data governance. And the defense technology cooperation channels that operate alongside existing security partnerships. Taken together, those pieces reduce reliance on a single bilateral relationship, especially one that has become unpredictable over the past few months. Trump's response hasn't changed that structure. He accused Canada of betrayal. He warned that defense commitments might be reviewed for participating countries. And he promised new tariffs targeting all alliance members. But at least so far, none of the founding nations have stepped back. No government has announced a withdrawal. No participant has signaled hesitation about remaining inside the framework. Financial markets offered their own kind of early reaction. Canada's currency strengthened against the US dollar following the announcement. Japanese and Australian resource companies saw stock prices rise, particularly those tied to lithium, cobalt, and other minerals included in the new supply chain agreements. In London, the British Trade Ministry described its participation in language that sounded almost relieved. Analysts there said the arrangement gives the United Kingdom a multilateral economic framework with stable democratic partners, something London had struggled to secure through bilateral negotiations with Washington since Brexit. And that reaction points to something subtle but important. The countries joining this alliance weren't necessarily following Canada. In many cases, they had already concluded that they needed similar diversification strategies. Different pressures, different timelines, but the same underlying concern about over-reliance on a single economic partner. Canada simply built a framework that allowed those separate calculations to converge. Foreign policy scholars have been describing the initiative in unusually large terms. Some say it's the most significant Canadian strategic move in roughly 70 years. Not because it resolves the current confrontation, but because the architecture is designed to persist long after this dispute fades. Trade frameworks create habits. Supply chains create investments. Regulatory partnerships create bureaucracies that tend to sustain themselves once they exist. Which means this alliance isn't just a news headline tied to a particular week in May. It's potentially a permanent feature of the strategic landscape. And that's why analysts are watching several developments very closely right now. One question is how Japan, South Korea, and Australia respond publicly to the suggestion that their defense arrangements with the United States could be reviewed. Their reactions will reveal whether the threat produces caution or reinforces the determination to expand alternative partnerships. Another question involves Europe. The Netherlands and Denmark are already founding members, but observers are watching to see whether additional European Union states move toward deeper participation. If the broader EU eventually steps in, the economic weight of the alliance would grow dramatically. And there's one more factor quietly being discussed in Washington. American defense treaties with countries like Japan and South Korea were ratified by the Senate. Any suggestion that those commitments could be reconsidered raises constitutional questions that typically involve Congress as well as the executive branch. So observers are paying attention to whether lawmakers address the issue publicly or remain silent, because silence in situations like this can carry its own message. For now, the facts on the ground look like this. On May 5th, 2026, Mark Carney formally launched a new Indo-Pacific alliance. 7 nations joined immediately. The structure contains 4 major pillars designed to reduce dependence on American economic pressure tools that had been used against Canada over several months. Trump responded with accusations of betrayal, warnings about defense commitments, and promises of tariffs. None of the member states withdrew. Markets moved positively for several of the participating countries' strategic industries. And analysts across the foreign policy community described the alliance as a structural shift rather than a temporary reaction. Which brings us back to the larger point. Those countries didn't join simply because Canada asked them to. They joined because the framework addressed strategic concerns many of them had already been thinking about independently. The result is a moment where the gap between a political accusation posted online and the geopolitical reality of multiple democratic nations signing a formal agreement has become very wide. And the consequences of that gap could shape alliance politics for years. So if you're following this story, keep watching the responses from allied governments in the coming days. Those responses will tell us a lot about whether this moment produces hesitation or something closer to a long-term realignment. And if you want to keep tracking how this unfolds, subscribe here so you don't miss the developments that are almost certain to follow.